Hi everyone. Today I'd like to give you a overview of the historical development of Japanese verses from the very beginning in the written record of literature, which is around 8th century, to the middle of 19th century. So it's a little bit more than 1,000 years. And summarizing it in 60 minutes or so is a bit of the challenge, but let's see how we can do it. Let me share this handout that you should have it through Manaba. By the way, it says October 5th, 2023. Actually, it is still at the end of August, and I'm in Iowa. Okay, so this is a very simplified history chart. What you should know is that before a Chinese civilization came to Japan, together with Buddhism and rice agriculture and its language, and very importantly, Chinese characters, uh, in 5th to 6th century, there has been a long period where Japanese people did not have any letters. It was purely oral. And as such, poetry up until the 5th or 6th century are essentially oral songs. And you know that there are many traditions of oral poetry, as in Native Americans or Sami people in the northern parts of Europe. And the Japanese people were the same. Um, and these oral songs did not have any fixed form. It's rather loose, but it is gradually taking shape and developed into waka or tanka, which I will describe um, very soon. Um, and this waka will further be um, transformed or developed into other forms of writing, such as renga, renku, hokku, or haiku. But essentially, it is originated from these oral songs with a Japanese indigenous poetry. So I color coded it in red. But all along in parallel, there was a long history of Chinese style poetry. Almost as soon as it is imported from China, the aristocrat, those people with education and power, used Chinese language and Chinese characters to record their language and use it for their politics, administration, as well as poetry. It was a required prerequisite for the high-ranking officials and aristocrats to be able to compose Chinese-style poetry. So here I'm using the blue color for this stream of Chinese-style poetry. And it is important that you understand that for all of these years, over 1,000 years, Japanese poetry or culture in general has those two streams in parallel. And sometimes they crash against each other, sometimes they complement each other. Okay, in the beginning there were no letters for Japanese, but only sounds. Can you imagine that? Um, Now you have alphabet A, B, C. Well, let's imagine there is no alphabet. You're only talking. This is a pen. I love you. It's all ears and tongues. One day, Chinese characters came to you, and there are many characters that have the same sound as I or L or V or U. So by using those Chinese characters, you are now able to write down your language on paper, which is fascinating. Maybe you should try. You can use your dictionary, uh, the Chinese English dictionary, to look for the Chinese characters that have the same sound as the English words that you are talking, such as I love you. And there are so many different possibilities for the combination of Chinese characters because there are quite a few number of Chinese characters for a given sound. And that's exactly what the Japanese people did at this juncture, especially around here, in order for them to record their history and their poetry in writing. But then there's a little bit confusing element. Chinese characters, of course, have sound, but also have meaning. So when a Japanese tried to use the Chinese characters as a symbol to express their Japanese word, there are two different ways. One is to use Chinese characters for its sound as a pure phonetic symbol. The other is to use the meaning of those Chinese characters and use it for the Japanese word that has a corresponding meaning, the same meaning, although the sound is completely different. Here are two examples. One is Japanese word, ame, which has many different meanings. One is heaven, the other is rain. Ame sometimes ama for the heaven, like Amanokawa is the Milky Road, and the rain. And of course, it's not unrelated. Rain comes from heaven. There is also some cases that we use ama for woman. Maybe there is some association with heaven, rain, woman. Now, there are many Chinese words or the combinations of those that have the same sound of ame. I just came up with this out of my head, the three different examples, but there can be many, many more. At the same time, this character means heaven or sky in Chinese characters, and this Chinese characters means rain. Two completely different characters for two different meanings. Let's take this word haru. Once again, Japanese word of haru has several different meanings, such as spring as a season, but also expand or swell. Because in spring, everything swells like the bud of flower or like the breast of a girl. The energy of life comes from within. That's spring. And the Japanese words haru can mean both the season spring and spring forward or expand or swell. And also it has the meaning of stick, uh, some tapes, for example, stickers. And so in this case, we could go two different ways of find a Chinese characters that happen to have the same sound as haru and use this word for as a phonetic symbol for haru, or use the different um, Chinese characters for the meaning. Now, that's a great opportunity that you can have two different ways, but also a source of great confusion. Now, this is the copy of Kojiki or Furukoto Fumi, which is the one of the oldest book ever written in Japan, around 712. And you can see it's all Chinese characters because there was no hiragana or katakana invented yet. And the preface of it is partly dedicated for the discussion about the methodology of using Chinese characters to express Japanese words. Well, here are a pair of two people. This guy, the same as this guy, he's a Ono Yasumaro, a very educated man who knows Chinese literature, who knows Chinese characters. The young man is called Hieda no Are. He's young. Some speculate that Hieda no Are could be a woman. We don't know for sure. But anyway, he could not read or write, but he was a genius with memory. It is said that anything that he ever hears, he can recreate with his mouth. And he has a super memory. And this Kojiki is actually the first history record of Japan, how Japan was made by gods and how it developed to this point of year 700. It is a sort of national project as the national identity of Japan comes to being. They wanted to establish their own history. So here is this Hieda no Are who remembers everything, the mythology, the legend from the very beginning of the genesis of Japan all the way up to the recent development. And this very well-educated man made a pair. And Hieda no Are speaks, and Ono Yasumaro tried to write it down by using Chinese characters. And in the preface, he is discussing the pros and cons of those two different ways of using Chinese characters, whether to go for sound or by meaning. He says meaning is quite useful because it in one word it can convey the meaning. So the text um, can be quite compact and shorter, whereas the sound requires for each syllable the different Chinese characters. It tends to be very lengthy. Besides, there are so many different combinations to make the same sound, so it's quite arbitrary. There's no rule. However, if you use the meaning, those Chinese characters for heaven or rain or spring, then it becomes essentially Chinese language and not Japanese language, because for Japanese, heaven is not this, which happens to have the tian or something in Chinese characters. But for us, it's ame, and it has the same sound of rain, ame. And that is important. And so what did he do? Well, he did what the Japanese are very good at, which is to make a compromise. In some part, he used the sound methodology, and for other parts, he used the meaning methodology. And I think he was quite aware that it is the second best. It is a compromise, because it's almost as if he is making a lengthy excuse by spending almost half of its preface of the first national book project. About 70 years later, there came another national project. Although it's not completely official, but the best and brightest of the Japanese poets at that time was all involved. And that is Manyoshu. And it's a collection of Japanese poetry from very old, which doesn't have any particular form, to more established waka form over the centuries, and the quite a huge number of volumes. I have some notes in here. Okay, it has 20 volumes and 4,500 verses. And it collects all the major poems written between 8,600 to 759, over 160 years. Okay. And it collects poems from all over Japan and from all classes of Japan, aristocrat, emperor, but also peasants, and farmers, and fishermen, and a lot of unknown poets. And the same situation here. It's all written in Chinese characters. And the way to choose those Chinese characters for a given Japanese text is quite arbitrary in terms of this selection of sound versus meaning. So much so that over this 4,500 poems, there are still many poems that nobody understands how to read. It's just like solving some puzzle. For example, this is one of the poem which the scholars managed to decipher. This is the Chinese characters in this Manyoshu book. And they figured out that it's Tarachine no haha ga kau ko no マヨ、ごもり。いぶせくもあるか、芋に合わずして。And the meaning is that it's so frustrating that I cannot meet imo, which is my love. Because my love is hidden somewhere, just like the silkworm that my mother is keeping. You know, the silkworm wrap itself in a cocoon. And just like that, my love disappears and would not meet me. And it's so frustrating. And this Chinese writing or the writing using Chinese characters and the original Japanese text, sometimes it use the sound, sometimes it uses the meaning, sometimes it's a mixture. Like this, tarachine. This word is swollen and hang down, and this is breast, and this is root. And has this sound of tarachine, but original meaning is somewhat related in terms of meaning too, that it is the certain word to proceed mother, because mother has the big breast to feed the baby. But what I like you to show as an example is here. It's read ibu seku. And long time people have problem in reading this. But then finally they understood that this character is uma, a horse. And these days, horse were supposed to make sounds like e. Today it's hihin in Japanese, the onomatope. But back in those days, it's e. And this is the voice of horse. So it's e. And then this is the sound of a bee. And bee, when it flies, the onomatope was boo. So those four characters, the first two is E, and these two is bu. Ibu seku. Mo. This is kumo, spider. So it's really like a puzzle. Very confusing. And this confusion is extended all the way to this day. If you have learned Japanese, you must have learned that there are three different ways of writing: kanji, hiragana, katakana. And if you see any Japanese book or text, you see the combination of those. And it's almost like kanji Chinese characters are scattered among the hiragana characters. And the Japanese people read Chinese characters together with those hiragana phonetics characters. But there are always two different ways of reading one Chinese character. Let's take this same example of rain. If you go for Chinese sound, it's u. But this means rain. And rain in Japanese is ame. So these Chinese characters, depending on the context, can be read both u or ame. The same as here, heaven, ten. But the Japanese original word is ame or ama. So sometimes we read this ame, sometimes ten. A good example is that if you see those two characters together, it's uten. That means rainy days. Uten. Now, uten does not have any meaning of the indigenous Japanese language. It is essentially the sound of foreign language, Chinese language, which are not used at home, especially with small children. Parents always tell a little child that 雨が降ってきたよ, the rain falls, and today お空は、雨だね。However, if he goes to school and he goes to the society, sometimes or oftentimes we rather use this way of reading, 音読み. 雨天、決行. That's the very typical phrase that you hear at the undokai, the sports festival. Even if it rains or the baseball game, 雨天、決行 means we do it, 決行する, despite the rain. In other words, this is more with our heart or bones, whereas this sound way of reading is more intellectual, something that you learn. My children were born in the United States and grew up in Germany, so their knowledge of Japanese language is rather limited. It's mostly from their ears, because I always spoke to them and still speak to them in Japanese and not English or German. So they understand ame. They understand this ame. But when they go to Japan and somebody says, uten, kekko, they says, what? What? Sounds like foreign language. And they're right. It is foreign language to some extent. So this double standard is a key characteristics of our language. And it's still here. Okay, I talked about hiragana and katakana. Those are the simplified version of Chinese characters. A Japanese alphabet. You see, the first 5 letters of our kana, which are 50 in total, and the first 5 is vowels, a, I, U, E, O. And those are the Chinese characters that have the same sound of a, I, U, E, O. And there is another simplification by taking these part of Chinese characters, a, I, U, E, O. So this is hiragana and this is katakana. And when you use this, there is no meaning of the original Chinese characters. It's a pure using the Chinese characters as pure sound. So when you say ame, you use this a and hiragana for me. Now, this hiragana or katakana, the Japanese alphabet, is very interestingly called onna de. Onna is woman. Te is hand. In other words, they are women's writing. Whereas Chinese characters were called otoko de, men's hand or men's writing. So there is some strong gender association. Why? Because it is mostly among women, especially the wives and daughters of the aristocrats who were given a good education, who used hiragana and write down their everyday language and their own song and poetry. Whereas their husband or father were at the palace doing politics or science or administration, and sometimes reading poems, or in the fashion of Chinese culture and Chinese poem style. In fact, as hiragana was invented and promoted by those educated women, they caused a sort of a literature and cultural revolution. Let me go back to this history chart. Now we are talking about Heian period, so around 1000 AD 1000 to 1200. Men used Chinese characters and composed Chinese style poetry in the palace. It's public in nature, whereas at home, more privately and personally, women started to write down the Japanese style poem in hiragana. So up to some point in Heian period, Chinese style poetry was considered much higher than waka or Japanese style poetry. Japanese style poetry is something like a hobby to be done at home by women. But as the national identity develops and as the Japanese people felt more independent from Chinese influence, as you have already seen, the history book was written and the Japanese verses anthology was compiled. By 11th century, the official poetry of the court in Kyoto Palace became waka. And the women were naturally much better than men in composing waka. So this blue stream and the red stream change its position in the cultural hierarchy in Japan. And now the men have to learn how to use hiragana and compose waka as opposed to the Chinese style poetry in order to get promoted in the court. So, in a sense, it's a women revolution, and women dominated the cultural scene, which has a certain implication or influence in the political dynamics uh, of the court. So I showed two poets in here. One is Sugawara Michizane, who lived in late um, 9th century, and Izumi Shikibu, who is the contemporary of the author of The Tale of Genji, for example, about a century later, from around 1000. This is a typical Chinese style poetry that men used to um, compose. You see, those, of course, those are Chinese characters, but they recite it in Japanese. 去年の今夜、清涼にはべりて、終始、詩編、団長の、終始詩編一人団長かな、something like that. Whereas the waka is more natural Japanese original language. 物を思えば、沢の蛍も我が身より、憧れいずる、玉かとぞみる。Now let me just explain what is waka. Waka has double meaning. This wa, and that's the Chinese characters that we use. Wa means, on one hand, Japan. If you go to Japan, people will always ask you, 和食それとも洋食? That means Japanese food or Western food. If you go to a hotel, they ask the 和室それとも洋室? 和室 is Japanese tatami mat room, and 洋室 is bed and chair. Toilet, 和式 toilet. You have to squat. Versus 洋式, the Western style toilet. So wa means Japan. So waka is really saying it's our national poem or song, not Chinese poetry. So a bit of the hint of nationalism here. Whereas, okay, but the other meaning of wa is harmony, to collaborate. For example, peace is now translated into heiwa, and wa is to be happy with the other people, to let go of your ego and work together, or to be one. So waka means essentially singing together, you and me. And in fact, many waka poems are written in the form of dialogue, especially very romantic one. Man compose one waka and the woman responds it by composing another, either saying, oh yes, or no thank you. Later, this waka is called tanka in the middle of 19th century, but essentially it's the same thing. Now, waka is a fixed form. Originally, it doesn't have any fixed form, but by Heian Jidai or late Nara Jidai, 8th, 9th century, gradually it was fixed into this form, which has 5, 7, 5, 7, 7 sounds. 物を思えば 物思えば。Well, actually, it's six, but you count it as five. 沢の蛍も, that's seven. 我が身より, another five. 憧れいずる, seven. 玉かとぞ見る, seven. Five, seven, five, seven, seven. That's the basic of the red stream in that history chart, the Japanese song. And it is very much alive up to this day. The meaning of this, I'm thinking of you. So much so that when I look at the hotaru, the fireflies over the creek, I thought it's my soul, 我が身より憧れいずる, that comes out of my body. 玉かとぞ見る, the soul, because it is so desperately wanting to see you, comes out of my body and fly to see you, just like the fireflies. That's the meaning. Beautiful. Once again, it's 57577. So this blue stream and the red stream, Chinese and Japanese, has this connotation of Chinese is more male, more official, and it's letters as opposed to voice. And the Chinese poem or Chinese style poem can be short, but can be quite long, that you can actually tell story, like the ballad. Whereas the Japanese waka, as I told you, is 57577. Only 31 sounds, very short. Chinese style poem can be quite logical, that it has always a strong sense of I as a subject, and some statement, points to make. Whereas Japanese waka tends to be very emotional, like my heart or my soul comes out of my body. It's ambiguous, whereas Chinese style poem tends to be clearer. It has a public nature versus private, and it does not fear a conflict. In fact, when Japanese people really try to make a point, despite causing some conflict, they tend to go for Chinese style poetry. Whereas waka, by the definition of this word wa, really always seek for togetherness, the fusion between I and you all melt into one thing. So it's quite different. And we have those two petals to express ourselves. And that's the richness of Japanese poetry or Japanese writing in general, but also the weakness, because it's sort of the split personality. You cannot express a complicated, logical, social agenda and challenge the authority, for example, by waka. It tends to get quite emotional. In part 2, you will see a fascinating example of how those two petals were used during the World War II, when Japanese people are getting all excited about the nationalism, but at the same time, it becomes more public, a poem for the country, for the emperor as opposed to myself. And there is this strange mixture of those two. I want to introduce here one literature called Tosa Diary, written by Kinotsurayuki in 935. It is a poem diary. It's a quite interesting format that I use often. It's basically a combination of poem and prose, poem and prose, poem and prose. In this case, prose being the diary that he was assigned to be the governor of Tosa. Now, today, Tosa is a nice place that you can go there by airplane from Tokyo in about 2 hours or something. But back then, Tosa was the end of the world. And being assigned there, meaning a demotion, no chance to get promoted in Kyoto Palace. And he spent 5 years there. And finally, he was allowed to go back to Kyoto. And he made the diary on his journey back home from Tosa to Kyoto over about 50 days or something. But what is remarkable about this piece of work, Tosa Diary, is that he pretended to be a woman. And the famous beginning of this book is called 男もすなる日記というものを女もしてみむとってするなり。Meaning, it is generally a man who writes what is called a diary, but now a woman will see what she can do. So he is playing this gender role, swapping it. And also, this woman character that he pretends to be is a servant girl serving the master of this trip, which is Kinotsurayuki himself. So, in terms of social ranks, he also makes it upside down. And I think what he really wanted to achieve by doing so is to assert the possibility of this red stream, Japanese language, against this cultural sphere of Chinese characters and Chinese style poetry. He's very much aware of this duality. Oftentimes, this character, a servant girl, says, oh, because I'm a woman, I can't write down any of those Chinese style poem that my master was reciting. But I can write down his waka. In some part, she talks about Abe no Nakamaro, who is a real figure, a historic figure who lived in the 8th century. He was sent to China when he was rather young as a trainee to learn Chinese civilization and ends up spending most of his life in China. In fact, he never was able to come back to Japan. And in this section, this girl is saying that かの国人、聞き知るまじき思いたれども. Well, she's talking about a poem that Abe no Nakamaro recited in one of the farewell parties when he tried to go home. Although in the end he could not because of the sea storm and he was almost drowned. But anyway, he composed and recited a waka. 青海原降り裂け見れば春日なる三笠の山に弟子付きかも. It's a nice poem thinking of his homeland, Japan, looking up the sky, wondering, oh, that sky comes from my home village's mountain, something like that. Now, but what is remarkable is this prose part that this servant girl is narrating, that no one in the party understood it because it's a Japanese poem and Japanese language. However, when he asked the Chinese people who understands Japanese and translated it into Chinese characters, then the people could understand the meaning, and they were all impressed by this poem. Just like the moon that he was looking up and singing about is the same, whether looked from Japan or China. The human heart is the same, whether written down in Chinese or Japanese language. It goes across the barrier of language and strikes the chord. I think it's amazing that in this sort of metafiction, Kino Tsurayuki is already discussing a translation theory, and but doing it in such a way of playing with this gender role in association with men, Chinese civilization, women, Japanese verse. Okay. Now we are finally around here. This day of a aristocrat is over, and the samurai warriors appeared, and more fightings happens. And it is around this period of Middle Ages that a fusion between the blue stream and red stream happens, and a hybrid style of writing emerges. We call it Wakan Kongobun. Wa, once again, Japan, Kan, China, Kongo, mixed or fusion sentence. Let me introduce the most typical Wakan Kongobun at the beginning of their formation. That's the beginning of Heike Monogatari, the tale of Heike. 祇園精舎の鐘の音。諸行無常の響きあり。皿掃除の花の色。聖者必須の断りを表す。おごれる人も久しからず。ただ春の夜の夢のごとし。高き者もついには滅びぬ。ひとえに風の前の塵に同じ。You can see the English meaning here. But if you look at this text, you see it's mostly Chinese characters with the same number of letters, with rather few hiragana in between. In fact, you can almost take those hiragana, this is no, 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 meaning of, no here, or out, and you can still guess the meaning. So essentially, it is Chinese style poetry, except you can read it in such a way that it is a Japanese storytelling. This and a lot of this style was applied for long ballad stories or philosophical essays. However, not for poetry. You got to wait once again for many, many more centuries. And once next week, I'm going to talk about it, but it would reappear during the war like a ghost from the past. Then the long, sleepy 300 years of Edo period comes. Yeah, this period. Yeah. The Tokugawa shogun finally conquered the whole Japan, then shut down any diplomatic relationship or tradings with the foreign nations except for Dutch merchants. And very inward looking, closed society emerged. Peaceful, no civil wars, although they prosecuted Christians quite harshly um, during this period, and especially at the beginning until everybody either died or went deep in underground. So we call it a big sleep, 300 years. During that period, Waka continued to be written. Kanshi was also continued to be written, and the hybrid writing was um, used to produce lots of masterpieces of early modern novels. When it comes to poetry or the Japanese verses, it was rather limited in this red stream. And there was some formation that out of waka, renga, and renku was developed. That's this 575 and 77 divided into two parts. The upper part, 575, I compose and ask another poet to continue the 77 bottom part in such a way that it can still be read as one waka, and then again ask the third poet to compose another 575 so that this 77 and his 575, still 31 letters and sounds, can be yet another poem. And it goes on and on and on, like a chain. 36 times, sometimes all the way up to 100 times or so. That's Renga and Renku. But at some point, people started to notice that this first 575 is very important. And sometimes without continuing the lower half, the bottom part of 77, this 575 alone can be enjoyed as a poem. And that is haiku. Haiku always have 575 sounds, only 17 sounds. And that is the beginning or first line of renga. In fact, it used to be called hokku literally meaning the starting line of poem. And only in later, the name was changed to haiku. But as I said, this rhythm of 5 and 7 are so deep in our mind that, I'm showing here 2 haiku. One is this masterpiece, haiku poet Matsuo Basho, probably the most famous haiku in Japan, Furuikeya 5, Kawazu Tobikon 7, Mizu no Oto, the old pond, a frog jumps, the sound of water. Now this is one of the traffic slogan, safety slogan. Papa yamete, wakimi keitai tobashi sugi. Papa yamete, stop daddy, wakimi keitai. Look aside or look at your handy. Tobashi sugi. You're driving way too fast. This is 5, Papa yamete. Wakimi keitai 7, tobashi sugi. So, Japanese loves the slogan. And for every occasion, and all the time, they come up with the new slogans and they put it on the poster. Oftentimes it's 575, 575, 575. It is the distinct mark of that red stream, which shows the way goes to the oral Japanese before any of the Chinese characters come. Now, this long sleep over 300 years of Edo period was abruptly disrupted, woken up by the visit of a warship from America. Admiral Perry is on it, demanding Japan to open up and make a commerce with the rest of the world. And in the end, Japan accepted it. And a very quick wave of westernization started. That is called Meiji Revolution and Meiji Ishin, the renewal. And that's what I'm going to talk about in part 2, up to the end of World War II. Okay, thank you so much. That's the very quick overview of the history of Japanese poetry. Thank you.